Hi everyone, and welcome to this video where we're going to analyse Act 2 of Macbeth. We're going to be looking at each of the four scenes, some key quotations, and Act 2 is quite short, but it also establishes some quite important themes for the rest of the play as well. Remember, as you're going through, you can either annotate your copies of the text, there's lots of space around that, or you've got the grids to complete as well, where you can start to record what's going on in each scene, key quotations, and how they link to context and wider ideas. And also it's important to note that what you might find in the exam is that some of the quotations you learn as standalone quotations, so you can talk about how a character develops. Some of them you might learn as part of analysing a kind of a wider extract as well here. So we'll start straight with Act 2, Scene 1, and this is the scene where Banquo and Fleance are going to bed. So remember, Macbeth's been having this party at his castle because he's been announced as Thane of Cawdor. Duncan and everyone has come to celebrate, so most of Scotland are here having this party, and obviously Fleance has been allowed to stay up late. Banquo's talking to him as well. Banquo just makes this brief speech about having a heavy summons lies like lead upon me, talks about merciful powers and cursed thoughts, and it's this idea that Banquo's talking about potentially the witch's prophecies, but also he's just talking generally about sleep here as well. In fact, he's tired after this party, but it does link at what's going to happen. But he's afraid of those cursed thoughts, the witch's prophecies, and this also leads up to his fate as well. You know, this idea that he's going to end up in heaven, the heavy summons, merciful powers, the good spirits, you know, morally good people, and cursed thoughts representing the witches and their evil, and later on Macbeth and how he becomes consumed by that as well. And so as we carry on onto page 24, Macbeth comes out and kind of speaks to him. Obviously this is just before he's about to murder Duncan. They talk about dreaming of the weird sisters as well. Macbeth says he thinks not of them, which is clearly a lie. And there's quite a nice little kind of, not a pun necessarily here, but a kind of use of language by Shakespeare. If you should cleave to my consent. Now, cleaving to someone's bosom is idea showing them kind of affection, you know, basically giving them a hug here. So if you look after me, I'll look after you. Macbeth is kind of saying here as well. But also the use of cleave, you know, meat cleaver is quite a thick bladed kind of knife. Used by butchers often for just chopping through kind of entire cuts of meat, taking skin and bone with them here as well. So the use of cleave represents this idea of keeping Banquo close to Macbeth, but it was also a kind of a pun potentially by Macbeth, or an ambiguous meaning by Shakespeare, to show the violent action of Banquo's brutal murder that comes later on. And Banquo mentions his allegiance clear, which is to Duncan, not Macbeth, and to Scotland. And is that loyalty Banquo's hamartia? You know, if Banquo sided with Macbeth, would he survive longer in the play? It's quite an interesting point, because obviously we know that Banquo's children are going to be kings. You know, Fleance, so would inevitably Banquo die in this society? Or if he'd been kind of more honest and loyal to Macbeth rather than Duncan, would he kind of survive a bit longer? And Act 2, Scene 1 has Macbeth's soliloquy where he hallucinates about the dagger, and there's a few things you might get out of this as well. First of all, the dagger is kind of a hallucination. I've seen it presented different ways in different kind of performances of Shakespeare. You can see it often as it could physically be a dagger, the dagger that Macbeth is going to use to kill Duncan he's holding in his hands there. But in terms of the text, if we treat it as a hallucination, and this dagger represents the act of murdering Duncan, and this is a dagger of the mind, a false creation. You know, is it something pretend? Proceeding from a heat-oppressed brain, and Macbeth's brain is described as heat-oppressed by Shakespeare here because he's kind of overheated, he's disturbed here. This links into, some of your historians will know this, the theory of the four humours, this idea that his brain is becoming too hot, and this is kind of perhaps due to the psychological pressure on him. People talk about Macbeth, it says at the bottom that I've written at the bottom of page 24, in terms of kind of a character consumed by guilt. But I don't think this is guilt here. This is somebody trying to contemplate the evil of what they're about to do. I would argue that as human beings we are not predisposed to going out and committing murder, particularly not murder of people who are close to us, as Duncan is to Macbeth. You know, Duncan has been good to Macbeth, he's rewarded him a title of Thane of Cawdor. It's probably as far as Macbeth was going to go, really, in terms of the social hierarchy and kind of, you know, ruling Scotland. And what Macbeth's doing here is basically he's trying to come to terms with the fact that he's got to kill Duncan. who is a good man, who's been good to him. And, you know, this is almost him becoming a murderer, his brain almost changing, his heat-oppressed brain changing to become a cold-blooded killer, to repeatedly stab Duncan, you know, in order to kill him, really. And that isn't something that comes naturally. I know, you know, we watch violent films, we play violent video games sometimes, but we become a bit desensitized to violence. And what Macbeth does is horrific. You know, it's a brutal, horrific, cowardly murder. And this speech is basically Shakespeare kind of having Macbeth prepare for that. Mine eyes are made fools of the other senses. And are they made fools? Are his eyes deceived by the dagger? Or are his eyes actually better to kind of murder Duncan? He's becoming resolved to that. And the blade and dudgeon are covered in gouts of blood, so the dagger's covered in blood. And it's the bloody business, and is that the kind of, you know, the guilt of having to do this, or the act of kind of becoming a murderer? But either way, by the end of this speech, Macbeth becomes truly convinced that he's got to murder Duncan. He's almost kind of, he's had the psychologically, he's given himself a pep talk here, and he's now psychologically ready to go and murder Duncan. He's described as the wolf, you know, this idea of metaphor for Macbeth, almost becoming savage here. This is a kind of a key point in Macbeth's character in the play, because he you know, he's gone from we will go no further in this business to Lady Macbeth to a cold-blooded killer, and he repeatedly murders from this point forward. And he wants to move like a ghost, and for Duncan to hear not his steps, you know, almost secretive. And does he want Duncan to not hear his steps because he almost wants Duncan to not hear what's happening? Or is this, you know, another example of being cowardly here? Cowardly because he doesn't want Duncan to wake up. He wants to make it easy on himself. And moving like a ghost as well. You know, this idea of being like a ghost, he's like a ghost king, really. He's an anomaly. He should never have become king. He's had to kind of break the great chain of being. So almost this spirit, you know, he's not a real king there. He's like a ghost king. And also, you know, kind of foreshadowing his own death later on and punishment. And you hear the bell rings from Lady Macbeth, which is the signal that the guards are suitably drunk. You know, hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or hell. A knell is a funeral bell to announce a death. And you've got the rhyming couplet of knell and hell here. And it's interesting that Macbeth mentions that Duncan could go to heaven or hell. To be honest, Duncan is going to go straight to heaven. He's been a good man and a good king. And the acknowledgement of hell here in the rhyming couplet with knell, the funeral bell, is almost Macbeth reflecting on his own death as well. Macbeth is going to go to hell for murdering Duncan, for committing regicide, and for breaking the great chain of being. And, you know, if Macbeth was tried in a court, obviously he'd be looking at a life sentence in prison, but obviously at the time he'd be executed. But thinking more of that, to a religious society, his crime is threefold. He's killing someone, he's killing the king, and he's destroying the great chain of being in the kind of the process of doing this as well. And he will go to hell, while Duncan goes straight to heaven, which we've seen in his earlier soliloquy. And then Act 2, Scene 2 is Lady Macbeth and Macbeth after the murder. And it's interesting that the murder of Duncan is not really shown on stage. You'll see it in film versions of the play you watch, but, you know, I suppose this idea that if you're going to kind of have Duncan be murdered on stage, it's quite difficult to do and make it look authentic, particularly in the Jacobean era and in Shakespeare's era, you know, when they didn't have the kind of the prosthetics and the use of makeup that we have now as well. That's his decision, and Lady Macbeth is kind of shocked really at first. You know, she's nervous here. That which have made them drunk have made me bold. She had a drink, really. She had a bit of Dutch courage, partly because of guilt, maybe. Quite unladylike behaviour at the time. And she hears the owl shrieking, and she's kind of made nervous by this. The owl is a bird of ill omen. She's talking here as well. She's thinking, no, it's okay, everything's under control. Macbeth comes in with the two bloody daggers, which is the first sign we get that Duncan is dead on stage. Lady Macbeth doesn't notice him enter here, and, you know, she says here, had he not resembled my father as he slept, I'd done it. And that's quite an interesting line. You know, would she have done it? I mean, Shakespeare having Lady Macbeth murder Duncan would be so shocking and so against the stereotypical role of a woman at the time that I doubt even Shakespeare would be able to include that in Macbeth. And this is just another example of an excuse. And obviously she realises Macbeth's here with my husband, and then straight away she kind of resorts to her old type of being manipulative. And on page 27, Macbeth says, "This is a sorry sight," looking at the daggers, you know. And she's a foolish thought to say a sorry sight. She challenged him immediately. It's almost like she snapped out of her earlier fear. And then, you know, this idea of an ambition, her ambition, his lack of her lack of conscience, you know, a foolish thought. It's not a sorry sight. This is great. You know, Duncan's dead. We're going to be king. We're one step closer to it. Even though Macbeth is holding 2 daggers and dealing now with the psychological effects of having murdered King Duncan. And as he walked back from Duncan's chamber with the 2 daggers, he heard Malcolm and Donalbain, the king's sons, in their rooms, laughing in their sleep. One cried murder. And obviously they didn't, but this is what Macbeth hears. This is psychological effect. And they say their prayers. And obviously this imagery here, Shakespeare, religious society. One cried, "God bless us," one said, "Amen." But Macbeth, with his hangman's hands, couldn't say Amen. He couldn't say Amen because his life is now removed from God. He now sees himself as evil, something completely removed from the religious society that Malcolm and Donalbain represents as well. Lady Macbeth says, you know, we mustn't think about this now anymore. It'll make us mad, which foreshadows her own madness later on in the play. And Macbeth with his sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep. Sleep no more, sleep no more, sleep no more. This idea that he imagines this voice crying out that he will sleep no more. And is it guilt that stops him from sleeping now? Or is it his conscience? Is it a case of, right, you have done, you know, one of the most disgusting crimes known to mankind. And as a result of this, you are not going to sleep anymore. Is it something more supernatural? Is it, you know, is it not actually something for his mind and the witch is almost crying out to him, or God crying out to him, punishing him for his crimes as well? And Lady Macbeth responds in true Lady Macbeth fashion by chastising him, by punishing him. You unbend your noble strength to think to brain sickly of things. Yeah, brain sickly. She calls him childish, you know, infirm of purpose, weak. And it's interesting, this idea. She basically tells him to wash his hands repeatedly in this scene. A little water clears us of this deed. Wash this filthy witness from your hand. She thinks it's easy to remove the guilt, and that contrasts with her later on. And this scene, Act 2, Scene 2, is reflected later on in the play when Lady Macbeth loses her mind. She relates to it. She kind of starts repeatedly washing her hands, and she even mentions the knocking, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. But Lady Macbeth thinks it's easy to remove the guilt, and brain sickly obviously is something she becomes as a result of guilt or kind of the effects of having to kill someone. She takes control and uses an imperative, "Give me the daggers," and then insults him, calling him a child, calling him weak. And obviously there's the knocking. She kind of goes off then to take control of the time, to become almost an accessory to murder here in this scene as well. And while she's out of the room, Macbeth, you know, wash my hands. Or is it because he acknowledges that, you know, he's done such an evil deed that, you know, he doesn't necessarily feel guilty. He's just saying, look, I'm never going to be able to clear my conscience here. The knocking then we look at here. We look at this right at the end. Lady Macbeth comes back in while this knocking is going on. "My hands are of your colour." She's now got blood on her hands after covering the faces of the men. "But I'm ashamed of you for wearing a heart so white." He's too morally good. He's too full of the milk of human kindness, whiteness, purity. And then we've got the knocking going on. So obviously they're in their castle, and there's knocking at the gates. This is the front gate of the castle, so it's not like the front door in a kind of a 2-up, 2-down house. It's knocking from quite far away. And so Macbeth finally acknowledges the knocking at the end of Act 2, Scene 2. "Wake Duncan with thy knocking. I wish you could wake Duncan up. I would thou couldst. I wish you could wake him up." And the four knocks are a character at the door who we see in Act 2, Scene 3. And that character is Macduff. And Macduff throughout the play represents goodness in society, religious goodness, moral goodness, justice, fairness, and almost the fact that this knocking is going on while Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are kind of planning and trying to clear their conscience. It's this idea that they can never fully be free, you know, of the evil that they've done, because Macduff knocking reminds them of that. And Lady Macbeth even mentions the knocking later on when she starts to lose her mind, and it's reflected in their mental state as well. Act 2, Scene 3 then. Not what you're seeing in Act 2 so far, Act 2 Scene 2, Act 2 Scene 1 even, Act 2 Scene 3. There's lots of extracts that the exam board could use, that AQA could use to put here, because you will get an extract from the text. The porter scene has come up before, so I'll talk about the porter. The porter is basically quite a minor character in Macbeth. He is a doorman really, so it's his job to open the gate when someone's knocking, and that will probably be a character of higher status than him. Because there's been a massive party, the porter is drunk. He's absolutely hammered, and of course Shakespeare uses this because it's funny to see people drunk on stage, and his audience would be watching Macbeth. The play would go on for about 5 or 6 hours without breaks as we have now, so they would just have to sit and obviously stand. The poorer members of society would pay a penny and stand, the groundlings they were called, for 4 or 5 hours, 5 or 6 hours watching Macbeth. So this is for them. We've got a drunk porter who's making rude jokes, bawdy kind of humour, we call that on page 31. Now we're not interested in the bawdy humour so much. What we're interested really is what we call satire, where Shakespeare is using this bawdy humour, he's using fun, comedy, to mock political events. And the porter's drunk, and he's basically comparing his job as a drunk porter to being in hell, because he's probably got a banging headache, a hangover, and he just wants to go to sleep, and somebody is knocking on the door. If a man were a porter of hell, talk about Beelzebub, who's there in the name of the devil, you'll sweat for it, who's there in the other devil's name, who committed treason enough for God's sake, this place is too cold for hell, I'll devil porter it no further. It talks about the everlasting bonfire. Now all this hellish imagery on page 30 and 31, the porter doesn't know that Duncan has been murdered at this point. We do as an audience, but the porter doesn't. And the porter doesn't because he's been right at the gate waiting to let people in. The fact that he doesn't know about this murder shows that everything he's talking about here is how difficult his job is, but it's also that element of satire, because he's mocking, and this is all a joke, but it's a joke based in reason. It's based in the fact that he is literally a porter of hell now because of the crime of regicide that Macbeth has committed, and the moral judgment and punishment that will bring on Macbeth's castle as well. And it's Macduff who enters hell. He enters a morally good character. He's innocent, he's not drunk, he's not been at Macbeth's party, he's pure, and he's going to challenge Macbeth here. And obviously Duncan kind of dies. We talk about the storm outside at the bottom of page 32. Lennox, the night's been unruly, chimneys blown down, lamenting's heard in the air. Nature representing the fact that the king is being killed here as well. And Macduff sees the death of Duncan and answers, "Oh horror, 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 tongue nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee." Macduff can't even bring himself to say what's happened. He's that shocked, because he represents moral goodness, because he represents justice and fairness. He can't conceive the fact that the king has been killed, and he can't even say the name. Imagine. He urges people to destroy their sight and looks on Great Doom's image as well. And he urges Malcolm and Banquo to rise up and look. Malcolm and Banquo are probably the only other two morally good characters alongside Macduff in Macbeth as well. And obviously Malcolm and Donalbain arrive and they're told that their father's been murdered. Banquo arrives as well. Lennox mentions, and obviously Macbeth says, "Oh yet I do repent me of my fury that I did kill them." So they're basically talking about what's happened, talking about the fact the guards are covered in blood. It's obviously them who've done it. And Macbeth says, "I killed them." And Macduff challenges him straight away. This would be quite a nice extract to get in the exam. "Why did you do that? Wherefore? Why did you do that?" Now, even though we as an audience know Macbeth has killed the king and the two guards, obviously this is a time long before forensic science, so the police aren't going to come do a crime scene and be like, yeah, okay, we'll take fingerprints, we'll take DNA samples, right, it's Macbeth that's done it. Even with all that, it looks suspicious that the king has died while he's in Macbeth's castle. It's certainly suspicious to Banquo, who knows about the prophecy. It's suspicious because Malcolm has been told he's going to become king, so does he wait for Duncan to die? Does he take the law into his own hands? But the fact of the matter is, it looks like the guards have done it. And by Macbeth killing them, those guards can never testify in a court, which would have happened. And yeah, they might find it was the guards. They probably would murder the guards. The evidence is kind of pointing against them. But Macduff challenges Macbeth because, why did you do that? Why did you kill them? because they're never going to be able to stand trial. And Macduff believes in fairness and in justice and moral goodness, and this isn't going to happen now. And Macbeth responds by saying, look, who can be wise, amazed, temperate and furious, loyal and neutral in a moment? He's talking about all the emotions he would have felt when he kills them. No man. And there's this, long kind of eulogy to Duncan here about his love for Duncan. And it's hyperbole, it's over-exaggeration. And Macduff doesn't even respond to it. He says, just look after your wife, look to the lady. So Macduff is starting to see through Macbeth. And then Malcolm and Donalbain discuss what they're going to do as well, because they realise that something's going wrong. Malcolm obviously would have the most to benefit. Malcolm is now king now that Duncan's died. So Malcolm is abdicating the throne really of Scotland. He's leaving to England because he realises something is going wrong. He realises he is probably going to be escapes to England, and Donalbain to Ireland. And Donalbain mentions there's daggers in men's smiles. Lovely quotation. This idea that Macbeth, who's welcomed them all into the castle, who's smiled on them, who's been the innocent flower, but being the serpent under it, actually carries a dagger to murder. And this idea that Donalbain and Malcolm can no longer trust anyone really in society. And the nearer they are in blood to the king, the nearer bloody, because they, although the rest of Macbeth's court would suspect Malcolm and Donalbain of the murder, we know they're innocent as the audience, and we know that they are probably going to have a pretty big target on their backs as well, because the guards are dead. So if we're looking for justice here, we're probably going to come to Malcolm or Donalbain next as well. And Malcolm, with his rhyming couplet, there's warrant in that theft which steals itself when there's no mercy left. This idea that he's abdicating the throne, he's leaving the throne, he's stealing himself away, but also this idea he's stealing himself away because there's no mercy. And it's the imagery that Shakespeare uses: theft, steals, no mercy left. Warrant as well, almost a warrant for arrest here. I know that's a modern take on the word, but this idea that they would be accused of the crime, and also the theft and stealing represents Macbeth's theft of the crown and the throne. Macbeth has stolen something, he's destroyed the great chain of being to become king here as well. Act 2, Scene 4 finally as well, which is Ross and the Old Man. The Old Man represents the common man in Scotland, and we'll get to a couple of things that are said towards the end of this scene, but this is basically a summary of what's happened so far. This idea that the guards killed the king, or this is who we suspect at the moment. Macbeth killed the guards, and Macduff is the one who mentions this as well. Malcolm and Donalbain have fled, which puts on them suspicion of the deed, and it's even, like against nature still. Could that be it's against nature, or could that be it's like all these other strange things happening? So do we put too much credit on this maybe as well? Macbeth has gone to Scone, or Scone, however you want to say it, to be invested. That was once the capital of Scotland and the site of a Scottish coronation, so that's why Macbeth has gone. So obviously you'd expect all the other thanes and lords. Ross is kind of, Thane of Ross, Macduff is Thane of Fife, and this idea that they would be expected to go to Scone and Scone pledge allegiance to Macbeth as their new king. And obviously Macduff goes back to Fife. He's starting to see through something suspicious is going on here, and Macduff suspects it really. Ross goes off, and Macduff says, lest our old robes sit easier than on you. And we've seen clothing imagery used earlier on in the play. Our old robes, basically the robes they would wear to be Thane of Fife in Macduff's case, or Thane of Ross. But here this idea, they would sit easier because obviously everything was in order then, and now the new robes, now Macbeth with his new robes, his borrowed robes, he is going to take over. And the problem is they're no longer going to sit easier in their positions, because Macbeth is constantly going to suspect people. He's murdered 3 people in the play so far. There are other murders to come, and Malcolm and Donalbain have gone, and so they're thanes of areas of Scotland. They're in charge of areas of Scotland, but those areas of Scotland have now been completely blown out the water by Macbeth stealing the throne and destroying the great chain of being. So they're like seconds in command. But seconds in command of what, when you've got a completely new leader and somebody who has stolen that crown as well? And the Old Man, who represents the common person of Scotland. God's benison, God's blessing go with you and with those that would make good of bad and friends of foes. And this is quite an interesting point. The innocent people in Scotland, the common man, the common person, common Scottish person, isn't represented in Macbeth. We see all these other characters, Macduff, Ross, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, But the average person in Scotland is going to suffer. They're going to have to make good of bad. You know, this is fair of foul and foul is fair again. And we've seen that in Donalbain's speech, where there's daggers in men's smiles. People who appear to be fair are actually foul and evil. But here it's more than Scotland at the time. You are in for a difficult period of time, because what is going to happen is Macbeth, as the new king, doesn't care about the people of Scotland. He just cares about himself and about keeping power. And so think about all the taxes, you know, leading to their earls, their thanes, you know, that would go to Macbeth. The taxes they would pay are just going to be used to keep Macbeth in power and to glorify Macbeth and to kill further people. And all the while, people in Scotland are going to get poorer and poorer, and things aren't going to be done to improve their lives. And friends of foes as well. This idea that, you know, Macduff eventually goes to England, Malcolm goes to England, Donalbain goes to Ireland as well, and they've got to make friends with some of Scotland's bitterest enemies. You know, England and Scotland have an uneasy historical relationship that continues today. It was James who was one of the people who first tried to unify Britain into a united kingdom, and obviously at the moment, you know, we're talking about things like a second Scottish referendum potentially happening as well. So people in Scotland are now going to have to make friends with foes to get rid of Macbeth. But also, people like Ross and other characters are going to have to make friends with Macbeth as an enemy in order to keep any kind of power that they want, you know, to keep their old robes really as well. And all the while, the people in Scotland that the old man represents, you know, as your average person, are going to suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer, because all Macbeth is concerned about is power and keeping that power. And, you know, he will go to any lengths, including murder, as he does repeatedly throughout the novel, to keep that power as well. So what I'd get you to do is go back through there are lots of extracts here that AQA could potentially use in the extract you'll get in the exam. Lots to look at, lots of language. Pick out 2 or 3 key quotations per scene and just try and explain what's going on, and also try and link it to some of those wider ideas. That doesn't have to be a piece of history. You know, it can be things like the Great Chain of Being. It can also be this idea of the lengths that people in Scotland, you know, suffered while Macbeth was a tyrannical ruler, and also how, you know, we have to make friends with foes, and how this theme of fair is foul, things not appearing as they seem, is repeated throughout the play. And we're just up to the end of Act 2 here, but in many different ways by many different characters.